Hello and welcome to Booklust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today at University Bookstore is novelist and sports writer Dave Boling. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Thanks for having me, although we may need to edit the sports writer
I
part
thought
of this.
that.
Now that I've been downsized, the inexorable demise of the newspaper business finally caught up to me after nearly 40 years. So fortunately I had alternate route paved for me when I reached this stage.
Yes, you had sort of been working up to it in a way with your first novel, Guernica, and now your new novel, The Lost History of Stars.
You know, I just loved being a journalist and covering sports, and there's just so much commitment and passion that athletes and coaches have, and working together with a sense of common purpose. And I got to go and be a part of that every day for years and years and years, and every day the story was different, and it was just a wonderful environment to be in, to the point that after my first novel sold and went pretty well, I had a chance probably to just become an author, but I so appreciated my job that I liked that contact with energetic, exciting people, and also with the readership that you develop on a daily newspaper.
How did you come to write your first novel? We should say they're both historical novels.
Yes.
You were a journalism major?
No, not at all.
Okay.
I was an out-of-work logger.
Oh.
In North Idaho. I'd been a college football player, I'd worked in the steel mills and car factories, I'd been a bouncer and a bartender, I guess kind of some of that Kesey background, you know. I had never written a word in my life other than school projects. When I answered an ad in the Coeur d'Alene Press in 1980, a small town in North Idaho, I was an out-of-work logger, and the ad was entry-level sports writer, $120 per week. And I thought, well, I'm not, that's 120 more than I'm making right now. Yeah. And I went in and I kind of talked my way into it. And it was kind of interesting. The editor saw me and he says, you know, you're kind of a big guy. You ever play football? Yeah, I did in college, in fact. And it turned out the newspaper had an annual game against, for charity, against the cops in the town, flag football, and so he hired me basically as a ringer with very little expectations for me as a journalist, and then 37 years later, you know, so it was kind of an interesting start. But there are a lot of people, there are a lot of journalists who get into fiction writing, and a lot of them are really good, and there's things that you learn by being a daily journalist, cranking copy, discipline. You'll never see a journalist complain about writer's block. There's never time. Deadlines don't care about your level of creativity at the moment. So I think it was really a good proving ground, and I could see that the internet was going to kill papers at some point. And at about 2005, I said, I have to try something else. And a good friend of mine, fellow reporter when I was in Spokane, was Jess Walter. And you know, as you know, I think he's one of the top American writers going right now. And he was still in the early stages of that. But having someone that you know kind of in your mind makes it, there's a sense of possibility. Right,
because you see that they've succeeded or they're on their way to succeed.
Yeah, there is some route to that. And when I gave myself a year, and it was starting at 4 in the morning, and when I was on a road trip with the Seahawks, let's say flying to Green Bay, I would work focused solely on fiction in all that travel time. Or at the hotel, rather than going out for dinner and beers with the boys, I would go back to my room. And in a year, I came up with a manuscript, and I sent it to Jess. I said, would you take a look at this? And about a week later, he called me and says, you know, you got a book here.
Nice.
And then another reporter friend, Jim Lynch, we've got a little community of former reporters. I sent it to him. What do you think? And he said, I think it's great. You could do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but I think my agent would like to see it. So I sent it to his agent, and in about a week she got back to me and said, I love it. And within another couple of weeks, she took it to the Frankfurt Book Fair, and it was sold around the world. And it was one of those stories that's impossible, that can't happen but it just struck
Yet it
perfectly
does.
for me. And I think it was just a lot of hard work, and in the back of my mind, the sense that it might pay off.
Well, I'm curious though, why, are you a big fiction reader?
Yes, always have been,
Uh-huh.
but never put myself in
Right.
the author's mindset. It's just that I knew there were certain things that I loved. I loved to read Steinbeck in his concern for social circumstances, and
Right.
the way the commentary, the Grapes of Wrath, the Joad family, those were characters I carried with me. The winner of our discontent, where the protagonist has this internal debate and moral issues that he's wrestling with. I thought it was really intrinsically American, and those were things that I really loved, and I'd always come back to. And maybe in the back of my head it was, okay, this is something that's really important to do.
Do you find that since you've written now 2 novels and are working on your 3rd?
Done, actually.
Oh,
but
done, congratulations.
thanks. It's not a novel yet until it sells,
Yeah,
so it's a
right.
project at this
Yeah,
point.
okay, fair point. Do you find yourself reading differently now? Do you, now pay more attention to the decisions perhaps that Steinbeck made in writing those books?
Not while I'm writing.
Uh-huh.
I really worry that if I'm reading somebody, that some part of their tempo or presentation will sneak into my works. So what I read when I'm in the creative mode is poetry. I read a lot of poetry because I love, the conciseness and the beauty and functionality and utility of every word.
Yes, right.
And I think that's a really good thing to keep in mind as you are creating. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
I try not to look at the mechanics of what fiction writers are doing, because I fear it will feel mechanical if I try to emulate it.
Even now, I mean, I've always read and I've always sort of loved books or not loved books, but it wasn't until I wrote this novel that I couldn't look at a book now and say, oh, that's why this person had this particular childhood, because the author needed that childhood to make this part of the plot work.
Here's what you might consider, and this is something that I had there was quite a gestation period for this book. Algonquin bought it in the summer of 2013, and I didn't know that it was going to be almost 4 years until it was on the shelves. They're a wonderful publishing house and do a great job, but they're smaller, and so they don't really have that turnover so much, and things get stacked up. So in the long run, that was really good for me, because that forced me to do some different projects. And my 3rd novel is now a contemporary, sort of a light family drama that I needed to change pace. I was getting a little bit of compassion fatigue, writing these dramatic
combat fatigue.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And when you write your characters, you develop closeness to them, and when they have a hardship, you certainly feel it. So I needed to do some different things, and one of the things is I wrote a screenplay. I tried that, and this is something that where there are very definite proscribed benchmarks that you have to hit to develop the conflict here, resolution here, the second level of main plot point, at halfway, and then 2/3, and it is very structured. And I would say that for people who are trying to write a novel, maybe learning some of those screenplay benchmarks would help organize how you go about it.
Do you want to write another screenplay?
Yeah, I've got another one that in mind too, that I need a trip to Estonia to do the.
I was in Estonia.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? Did you read about the singing revolution?
Yes.
Yeah, I want to
absolutely.
I want to. It might maybe a theatrical play might be.
Yeah,
might
that
be
would be. I
really
can recommend a good hotel in
Tallinn.
Tallinn. Yeah.
Very dramatic. But every writer does this. You can ask him, "What are you working on?" And he's got 15 things in the mind that that are stewing, and so often it's just hard to get to it. But the beauty of being laid off as a journalist, now I have more time to work on my fictive,
your fictive.
Projects.
It was interesting to me, your choice of subject matter in both of the novels. So the first one is Guernica, which is set during the Spanish Civil War, the war between Franco taking over the Spanish government from the elected leaders. And then the new one, The Lost History of Stars, is the Boer War. And where did all those come from? Those ideas?
Through marriage, I was related to a number of Basque people, and so I'd heard for years people who were in the region or actually in Guernica during the bombing. Everybody in that country was touched by that, and after 9/11, I was a little disappointed that nobody ever tracked back the history of these assaults on innocent civilians back to Guernica, because that was such an early atrocity in this series of attacks on civilians. And so when I came to the realization I need to try some different form of writing, I started researching the bombing of Guernica, and within the first 5 minutes I was convinced I was obliged to write the book. I came upon a scene, and there are times where it's a tough read, and it's tough for me even to talk about it. 9-10 years later, doing this research, there was a story about they only had a few doctors in town and a couple of nurses, and so a lot of the nuns from the local convent were serving as nurses, and there was 1,000 or more people who were wounded in this bombing, and they kept seeing people come in. Some had, bullet wounds, and some were burned from incendiary bombs, and some had things fall on them. But there was a number of people who had their hands torn to shreds, and the flesh was worn off the bones of their hands. And the doctors were, what in the world was this? Well, they discovered it was people who were so driven to find loved ones that were hurt in the bombing that they would dig through jagged rubble and broken glass. And I had read, I don't know how many books, but I had never come across a scene that to me exemplified that one burning nugget of what real family love is that you would harm yourself and physically maim yourself, just senselessly driven to try to save your loved ones. And at that minute, really, within half an hour of starting to research that topic, I was obligated to do so. So for the second one, and the first one went well, and I think maybe I need to stick with this a little bit. I looked back into the history of my grandfather, who was a British soldier at the time of the Boer War. And he was much older, so he died before I got to know him, but family lore held that he was some kind of a guard in South Africa during the Boer War, about the turn of the 20th century. And again, within a few minutes of researching this, I came upon a fact that I didn't know. And I mean, I almost really literally smoked myself in the forehead. Why didn't I know this? The British established concentration camps 40 years before the Nazis did it in the Holocaust. And it was not intentionally genocidal, but they brought in women and children who were displaced by their scorched earth policy, and they put them in places of concentration. And they were poorly administered. There was poor sanitation, lack of food, illness, terrible conditions, and 27,000 women and children died in these camps. And and that was way more than soldiers in this war. And so literally it was a war against children. And I didn't know that. I was outraged by my ignorance, and I thought other people need to know it too, and so that's why I created the book. But it's not easy. I say it's not. I like to say it's not a feel-good read. It is a feel-deeply read.
That's a good way of putting it. And I was interested that Candace Millard's book that just came out, came out last year, I guess, which deals with Churchill. and
Yeah.
And the Boer War, which very few people really know anything about.
Right.
Although I was once talking about Candace Ballard's book and how the Boer War made Churchill's early reputation as a writer.
And Gandhi was a stretcher bearer on
right.
one of the same battles that Churchill was reporting.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
It is.
How the
connection.
historical, the future of war and resistance kind of met at that same spot.
You know, when I heard that your new book was about the Boer War, which I've always been just fascinated by, partly because I don't know if Candace Ballard told the story or if I read it someplace. One of the British ambassadors during World War II was interviewing Himmler, maybe, and said, well, what about these concentration camps? Where did you get the idea for this? How'd you dream this up? He said, oh, we got the idea from you. You did it in the Boer War. And
that's kind of the attitude the British still have.
Yeah.
My first novel sold enormously in England, and so my publisher Picador was quick to jump at the second one,
Right.
and they liked it, and it having a specific English connection really saw great
Right.
things for it. It turns out the English are not real keen on being reminded of basically the barbaric situation that they created.
Yeah. And we think of the Boers as, they don't have the best reputation in our these days because they were racists, and yet does anyone deserve the treatment that the British?
That was a big dilemma
I bet.
for me as a fiction writer.
Right.
Can I create a sympathetic protagonist when the contemporary view of the Boer/Afrikaner
Right.
is that minority that established the apartheid system? And also, when they went on their great trek out of the Cape Colonies, they oppressed the native tribes that lived there in the first place. And it was real difficult for me, and I thought those kids that died they had nothing to do with that. It was a horrible situation, and maybe this is why nobody has told it very often. And I really felt that it was worth it. They weren't responsible for that. It is difficult, though, when you have a narrator telling the story, and particularly early in the story, I have to keep my narrator reliable and based on fact and her actual true perception. I could not have her preternaturally aware of social situations. All she was exposed to were the lessons of her father, the lessons of the Dutch Reformed Church that was a fairly rigid Old Testament sort of religion at that point. And it is only through the increased worldview that she gains by living through this camp and seeing human suffering and the way people can treat other people, is that when she comes back, she has more of a worldview. And the person who really provides, I think, the best counsel and wisdom and insight in this is Bina character, who was one of the natives who worked for her family. And so subtly I could try to hint of the future where my protagonist and narrator Letty says, well, I know we'll never trust anybody else again, and we'll never give our power over to anyone. And then she asks Bina, what about your people? And in her wisdom and her capacity to use tribal phrases, she says, well, a beaten dog learns to bite. And so that's the best I could do. I couldn't hit readers with a cudgel on it, but I was very concerned. I don't want to think that, well, this is glorifying a culture that is oppressive of other minorities. So it's a tricky line to make your narrator believable.
Why did you choose to make your narrator, and really the center of the book, a young teenager?
Because I wrote
female teenager.
Which I've never been a 14-year-old girl.
Don't tell me that.
I did it. I did a full book-length version, kind of Michener-esque, of the soldiers on the field, the women in the camp, the young girls, the native in the camps that they established for the British, and it was big, and it might have sold better. Do we need another novel like that of a war? And I thought, let's clarify my goal here, and it was to examine the effect of war on the innocent parties. They don't give parades or give medals to the women and children who suffer the losses as well. They just think about soldiers, and I wanted to put a face on this. So I wrote another book-length version from the perspective of 4 women who were in the various camps. And it was because cleaving to historical reality, it was such a grim story. I couldn't inflict that on the readers. Oh my God, I'm almost crying just as I'm typing. This is tough. And but there was a bright spot in that version, and it was my 14-year-old girl. And so I scrapped that second book-length edition and said to Letty, you want to be a writer? I'm going to give you the chance. You be my narrator. And I think she brings a sense of a little bit of an Anne Frank sense of hope, but a lot more actively resistant. And she has little daily insurgencies fighting her own war against the British by snarling at them, saying nasty things, looking at them with scorn, and then stealing the camp rules every chance she had.
And the opening scene, you see how, what a rebel she is, and how much she, even at that early scene before anything, I mean, terrible things are happening. The British are going to burn down her house and are threatening, to kill her family. But she doesn't have that sustained pain that she gets when they're in that place of concentration.
And at the end, and I thought it was really important, how does a guy who is in his 60s, a man, inhabit a 14-year-old girl? I talked to every woman I knew. What were you thinking about 13, 14, And then I went to some female psychiatrists and psychologists. This important, difficult transitional stage in a woman's life, what are the effects of that taking place in this crucible of pressure and stress and illness? And they were very helpful. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, Eddie Hillison's book, An Interrupted Life. Those things helped me see what kept a person going in times of difficulty. And those were the things that I tried to put in her head. And really in the last third of the book, which I'm really proud of, she's hallucinating. And she's lost touch with reality, but that is how she deals with it. And she creates her own alternate
I was going to say it becomes
reality.
Her reality.
Because that's the other was intolerable. And it was really wonderful. One of the book bloggers in England mentioned that she did a list of literary heroines for International Women's Day last spring, and she picked 5, and Letty was the only one who was written by a man, and so she made special note of that, and I was really proud that got across, that it was believable as a woman, but I spent a lot of time working at it.
Well, before your book, the only other novel that I know of, a contemporary novel that deals with the Boer War, I don't know if you ran across this book when you were doing any, or even if you read fiction while you were working, leading up to this. It's by a man named Richard Mason, a British guy, and it's published in England under one name and in America under a different name, the book. But here I believe it's called Natural Elements, and Lighted Rooms is the British title. And that was the book, I think came out maybe 10 or 15 years ago now. It's been a while. But that was the book that first made me very interested in the war, because it's the first book that I had read about that war. You know, there's so many wars you read about, but you don't run across the Boer War.
And you know what struck me as fascinating? is this endless cycle of wars for the same reason. I think that's one of the great fallacies of wars, that anybody learns anything from them other than how to conduct the next war. And this at the turn of the 20th century, when 100 years later at the turn of the 21st, the basic imperialism and botched nation building for the sake of resources was going on in the Middle East. And if you take the British were driven by the gold and diamonds in the Boer republics,
and the oil and the
well, now if you replace that with oil, then you have to see the same thing. And then they called some of the Boers, they called them refugees, when basically they were prisoners. And how different might the experience be of my protagonist to, let's say, you know, one of the young Syrian girls who's on a boat trying to cross the Mediterranean. And the point that I hoped for is maybe we can learn something. 10 years from now, maybe there'll be a story about a Syrian girl that goes through the same sort of thing. It is probably a futile hope that anybody will learn anything, but when the fiction writer can create a character to which readers can embrace,
Right.
then all of a sudden it's not statistics.
Right.
It's a human being, and then they can feel and have more empathy for what people go through when they are in in the shadow, in the suburbs, the emotional outliers of the war.
Dave, our time is up, I'm sorry to say, because I feel like I have a ton of other questions that I could ask you.
Well, we can keep talking when they turn the cameras off.
But thank you again for coming to the show, and good luck not only with this book, but the third one, and the fourth and the fifth. And
I'm going to keep cranking. I've got a lot of time on my hands.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dave.
My pleasure.